MT, can you hear me?
Yep.
This is our first live show back.
Yeah, it is.
Does it feel different?
It's good to be out of YouTube jail.
It is good to be out of YouTube jail. I feel free, and there's nothing more rebellious than coming back with the show that YouTube pulled last year.
That's right.
And like, hey, we know we are on probation, and we're gonna walk around with alcohol in a paper bag, and you can't stop us.
At 5 a.m.
So let's continue to give a middle finger to the man.
Yep.
Good morning to most, good afternoon to others, and good evening to the viewing audience across the pond. I'm Jason Miles, your host for another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you are new to the channel, please like and subscribe. If you're enjoying what you see, make sure to hit the notifications bell so you are always alerted whenever we go live. We are constantly adding new episodes, doing cross streams with other channels, and adding new additional programming. Speaking of shows, we will be returning with White Guy Wednesday again this Wednesday. It's coming back. And speaking of back, we're back from the tyranny of YouTube prison. This is our first live main show since we've been back. We had stuff ready to go for the YouTube lockdown for cyberbullying, which I still don't understand. So let's bring in the crew. That lovely voice you hear next to me is the faceless voice of reason, M. Toussaint. Please welcome M. Toussaint.
Hello. Still faceless after all this time.
And that's why you weren't on the Halper show with us, because you were faceless and you didn't know. Right. They didn't know how to deal with that menacing power.
Sometimes people discriminate against my people.
That's what you identify as?
Yep.
You identify as faceless?
Yep.
It's good to know. It's good to know. I feel like I'm in a special club because I actually know what you look like.
That's true.
And if we're ever in public again, you can just kind of disguise your voice a little bit and no one will know.
That's very true.
What do you mean I sound like M. Toussaint? And also back live for the first time in some time. You may know him from his appearance on the Katie Halper show. You may also know him from the Joe the Postman episode of That's My Mama. He is the one, the only, the body jack extraordinaire, Pascal Robert.
Body jack extraordinaire. Interesting.
The Pascal body jack bit that Toussaint did months ago has taken on a life of its own to the point where we have gotten messages about Pascal jacking his body.
Pascal Jackmaster Robert, that is.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings Jason Miles. Peace and greetings. M. Toussaint, as you all probably have guessed, I'm very psyched for today's show as a fan and admirer of house music.
Kyle Drum says, jacket, jacket, jacket. Oh, that's funny.
Check it out, Pascal. You've got a new name.
Jack Master.
Yep.
How did this happen?
Well, you know what makes me sad about this show? Because this is a main show. We can't like play the music that these guys have literally made, which before the show, for no reason whatsoever, I wasn't even thinking about this show. We Got a Love Thing was just stuck in my head. And I think it's because I made this house mix for Pascal that I hope he finally opened. I went back, I was like, oh dude, how can I have a house mix without, CeCe Peniston on it? Is it even a house mix without Robin S. and CeCe Peniston? Pascal's holding in all his Jack. Look at him.
Holding in all the Jack.
Look at him. It's so hard. It's so hard for him to contain it.
Ain't gonna be no jacking when ain't no music.
I'm actually really stoked to do this episode because Pascal, if you guys did know, is a big house music fan. But before we start, again, I just want to say thank you to the Patreon community and all the subscribers, all the new subscribers that have come on to the channel, and even the people that are subscribing to the audio-only version of the podcast. For those listening and you enjoying what you see and you'd like to show support, there's always Patreon, and you get access to the Champagne Room. You get access to the call-in shows in the Champagne Room. You get access to be part of the live audience for the Mau Mau Hour with Pascal Robert, where you can call in and challenge his ideas or just comment on what you think about his ideas or comment on anything. There's only one way to do that, and that's become a patron. Patreon.com/Bitterlake Presents, and for as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year, it can all be yours. Now, longtime listeners of this show, about a year ago, we were approached by a patron of ours to discuss the class makeup of house music. If you didn't know, MT and I are fans of the genre, but Pascal Robert is more than a fan. He was there from the early days of house music. So that hits that sweet, nostalgic, emotional spot. We did a show explaining the trajectory of house music, how it was born out of disco. We touched a little bit on the class aspects of house and its subgenres. But today we plan to take that conversation even deeper with our guests who, let's be honest, have made some of my favorite music that I still listen to today. And every time Jeremiah talks, it's always like, you worked on what? You did what? So these are guys that have literally been there from the beginning. So even off air, we had a conversation that was kind of like, oh, damn, okay, this is going to be a really, really fun show. So sit back, relax, get your popcorn ready. Please welcome returning guest. This time you can see him, so we know he's not AI. Jeremiah McAllister.
Please wait.
Oh, look at the hoodie. Look at the hoodie.
Oh,
That's
God, this is revolution.
You can't buy that one. You got to be a patron to get that hoodie.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Oh, okay. That's the real. Okay, he's the real. That's the real deal.
I had
And
to, yeah.
also,
I had to show support.
Co-super producer Eric E. Smooth. Bam.
I don't have merch to represent, just the H.
H for the hose.
Used to be formerly H for formerly O's. Reform.
I want to ask silly question first and foremost. Now that we're all here, and I wanted to get right down to business. Usually on Saturdays we call it the Saturday Free Show, and we're still gonna go over the hour. But usually we have news topics and other things we discuss before we bring the guest in. But since the house music show was one of our more popular shows, I say surprisingly because we do a lot of music shows on here. I am a musician. And I bring my music friends on, and sometimes those shows don't do all that well. But the house music show, I don't know if it's because it got pulled midstream, but man, the response, when are you going to do another house music show? So finally, and it took forever, Jeremiah, because he's an important cat, is the hardest dude. Anytime we have like entertainers on this show, guys, just know I'd much rather book 12,000 academics than one entertainer. Sorry, brother, I can't deal with you. I got a jet set. I can't make it that day. I got a jet set. So thank you again for taking the time to talk with us. So for the people that didn't see that episode a while back, for you guys, what are the origins to you of house music?
Let's let Eric start on that one. I kind of gave my take last time, so that's what I brought him. I invited him today because I knew he was going to have a good perspective on this.
So the origins of house music. Now you have to do this. You have to divide house music culture from house music genre, right? So house music culture is a phenomenon that had a lot of contributors in terms of it originates from the Black gay culture of the warehouse, but also strongly from a South Side kind of bougie elite culture that developed on the South Side in a separation of upper mobile Blacks, right? So there's a school as a focus in Chicago called Kenwood High School that Shaka Khan's from, Lena McLean's from, R. Kelly's from, but don't count. But more importantly, some of the house music originators like Jesse Saunders, Celeste Alexander, Andre Hatchett. There's a list of people that from that culture that went to this focus school, Kenwood. Their rival is a school called Whitney Young, which Jerry went to and represents very well. Within that rivalry then expands into the Catholic school culture and the other higher end, if you will, public schools, right? So if you take that and mold that together and say that there was a subclass of the Chicago South Side that were partying together, right? And from ages, I would say as young as 13, which was probably more rare, to ages, upwardsly of 20, 21, all partying together in the same scene. And their music influence was stuff that came from New York City, the West End label, Prelude, South Soul label, but also Italo disco and some disco classics as well. All of that meld together with maybe some contemporary radio songs here and there, like Alicia Myers, I Want to Thank You, and a few other records like that, but really pushing off and trying to be rebellious in that it wasn't what was going on in the mainstream for Black Chicago at the time. And even some of that influence, because the culture part is deep. It has a lot of different layers. Some of that influence came from a punk scene that came before the proper house scene, if you will. And that was led by a really popular DJ, Herb Kent, who was popular with adults. He had a show that was just an hour show, but it was so impactful with a younger teen audience. So while in his day job he was appealing to adults with, you know, the contemporary music of the time, the Stevie Wonder, the Patti LaBelle, you know, just typical black music. He was also playing these crazy imports like I'm Turning Japanese and Cars by Gary Newman, and things that would be totally opposite of what he would play during his day job during this hour for teens. And that built the scene as well. And those scenes kind of came together to make the house scene. Take that one more step, and there was a hot mix show on BMX, the Hot Mix 5, that comprised of 4 non-black DJs and one, I was going to say very black DJ. That was wrong.
You were on the show with nothing but black people, so it's totally fine to say.
So Farley Keith, right, was on the show, and I say that with love, that he was very black, and then he was unapologetically black in his exposing the music. So if you picture when that show first entered, you know, you had very commercial, contemporary music, like You Dropped a Bomb on Me by the Gap Band, and maybe a Cyndi Lauper song, and maybe all of these different dance mixes that were being played on the north side of Chicago and downtown. But then here was Farley's hour that represented us, and that was one of the key factors, as it gave us voice, but it gave us voice to millions of people. And his impact, I'm sure we'll cover many times in this hour. But his impact was a leader of the culture that then turned into a leader of the genre. And the genre was kind of created from a drive of the competition of the DJs, which Jerry and I were both part of that movement, in the sense that, and Jerry may disagree with me because I don't know where he places himself on the hierarchy, right? But there was an A-list level of DJs that comprised of Farley and Steve Hurley and Jesse Saunders and some Wayne Williams at the time, and some of those Wayne Williams and Chosen Few, just to acknowledge that brand. Those were kind of the A-list DJs, and they were the go-to, and they were the every weekend. They were playing the Sours and the Penthouse and all of that stuff. Well, what is also recognized more so by us than the world, and don't let me not include Frankie Knuckles in that, and then later Ron Hardy, but and Lil Lewis, can't forget Lil Lewis in that. But anyway, long story short, is there were an A-list of DJs, right? But in support of that A-list, and I don't know that we get enough credit, is the second tier that I feel like Jerry and I belong to, where we did the house parties, the school parties, the parties at the lodges, the parties at whatever space that these teens could get a hold of to hold 200 to 500, sometimes 1,500 people. And we were doing those parties, and those parties supported the scene in a way that the A part did not, the headliner part did not have to carry the whole thing. In fact, if you think about it from an exposure standpoint, our tapes, our DJing those parties probably took a song that was popular on the A side, and then we then carried it through and made it, you know, a cult record or a classic. So they broke the records, and then we played the records. It's kind of a way to consider that. So Jerry and I are from that part of, in my opinion, from that part of the scene. And then there's a whole host of dancers and people who were, you know, fashionistas and just, you know, influencers all throughout the name.
It's interesting that you use the term influencer. I would love to ask both of you guys, you know, using that terminology, influencer, how much did New York club kid culture of the early to mid 80s influence the music you guys were making? Were they at all part of your demographic, or is that literally a different world?
I would say yes and no, and I don't mean to dominate. So Jerry, tell me to shut up when I shut up.
No, keep going. You're doing good.
Yeah. We were in our own bubble. So here's the funny part, right? Everybody references the warehouse, right? If you really had a sampling of how many people, if you said our scene was comprised of, 10,000 teens, right? In various motions came to these parties. In the beginning, I'm speaking of. Obviously, it grew way bigger than that, right? But let's say it was 10,000 teens in total from all of the different high schools and stuff. If you took a sampling and said how many of those teens actually attended and went to the warehouse that only held 150 people, my understanding that it was 21 and over. So all those people that were, I got in, I was 13 when I was there. Stop it. You know what I mean? It's probably less than 1% of the people that attended that party. So most of the information was second, third, and fourth hand of the culture that they were back to the warehouse. I mean, from the warehouse. And obviously the warehouse was supposedly influenced by New York club culture. So I think as much as there was some influence by New York club culture, I think that most of it was homegrown from our imagination. So people walking around in polo boots, for example, because they thought that's the way the elite East Coast people, behave.
Right. Well, that's what it.
Yeah. With not a horse to be seen in sight. So in terms of that culture, I think that our influencers from their imaginations, from probably magazines and TV shows and all types of other, culture.
We had some of those influencers though that were like looking at GQ magazine and other things like that were actually kind of paying attention to the New York scene. And so they were trying to represent that to the rest of Chicago. But the rest of us probably really didn't know what was going on actually in New York. But he was talking about the influences. There were certain people that were like the cool people on the scene that everybody kind of, looked up to. I don't know if that's the right way to put it. But, there were certain people that were really popular on the scene. And some of them were definitely into the New York culture thing. They were, like I said, they were reading GQ magazine and Interview and all of that stuff that was, really popular in the 80s. They were into the whole Warhol and, just Basquiat, everything that was going on there. There were people. Right. Yeah, there were people that were into that. And some of those were the influencers that he was talking about on the scene. But most of the rest of us really kind of didn't have an idea of where that was coming from, And like he was talking about, the polo boots and all that. Yeah, they would see something like that in the pictures in GQ magazine and, and then dress like that. But, no horses to be seen, as he said.
Hey, I wonder, Jerry, did anybody actually from our scene attend the Mancuso parties, the Dave Mancuso parties?
The Loft? Yeah, that was, no. Well, no, I mean, I think the Loft even ended before I even started high school. I'm not sure, but the Mancuso, yeah, that was the thing he did where it was like basically his home and he turned it into a club. And that's what really started. But, but that's the thing you could see is that almost all the sub clubs, the other little clubs we had were actually all named after New York clubs. Like someone started a warehouse party here and they called it the Loft. Right. There were other things like that where they would take things like, oh, we heard this is what's going on in New York. Oh, we got to do this. And, and they named everything after those places in New York where they were having, where the scene was going on. And yeah, the music was also coming from there. I mean, Frankie was best friends with Larry Levan. So he was always getting music from Larry, so we were definitely influenced by the New York club scene, but in a way, for most of the average kids in the scene that didn't know anything about it, it kind of helped it to develop its own life,
I want to ask you this question real quick because I know Pascal has a slew of questions. But because I'm working on kind of a large video essay project that does deal with adjacent this genre of music, so I'm assuming you guys are sampling kind of willy-nilly at this point because the sampling technology is now slightly less expensive than it was, when it first comes out.
No, we didn't sample at first.
No sample.
So you're just using drum machines at this point.
Yeah, at first.
And so there were word samples, but there weren't music samples.
So you're just triggering, because you probably don't even have that much. If you can sample something, I forget how much
Right.
sample time there was in those early samplers. I think you only had like 4 bars, right?
Right, the early S900.
Yeah.
And so this is basically just drum machine, drum beats, because I mean, how many people are able to mic drums in a house or pay for
Right.
studio time?
Right.
Which is another thing. So was sampling kind of a little more rampant in this area?
No, sampling, I would say that sampling probably is a third generation thing in the house genre.
So what, I hate to be the gear nerd here, but what equipment are you guys using right now to make this music?
First, it was like an 808. My first demo that I made was my brother had an 808. I borrowed Eric's sequential tom, and I had a Juno 106 keyboard, Roland Juno
Oh,
106.
yes.
And another friend had a Tascam 4-track recorder that I made my demo on. So that was like, and no sequencer. It was just like, I could sync things up with the 808, but the early tracks, that was it. It was just raw. Just this is drum machines playing the parts by hand.
You're doing this live time? You're playing the parts by hand live time and then trying to sequence it. Okay.
Yep, exactly. Awesome. It would be another 2 years. I think when I made my first demo, it was probably another 2 or 3 years before I actually got a sequencer. So the first 2 or 3 years I was doing it, it was like all like manual.
It's really fascinating to me that you guys herald back to this era of the late 70s to early 80s and the class dynamics that you're talking about in Chicago, with how this music is appealing to elite public school kids. These are usually schools that you have to get tested to get into, as well as Catholic school kids. And what's fascinating to me, right, is that I like the Paradise Garage in New York closed like my freshman year of college. But my older cousins were very much into the garage scene, and Studio 54 opened for a brief period of time in the 80s as well. And that scene was also very populated by, I wouldn't say like elite blacks, but blacks they weren't from the hood public schools at all. They were definitely kids who were more adjacent to be going to college, to universities. And what's really fascinating is that house music in New York is just one of the multiple urban black music genres that's competing in music spaces. And what I like about what you guys as producers are old enough to remember, when house music was one of the varying competing black urban music forms. Can you talk about the time when you literally listened to black music and you didn't have to worry about listening to one genre like we do now in hip hop, when there were competing music forms of black music that you would hear on the radio, and house was competing with disco, with R&B, with hip hop, and there was a mutuality of an atmosphere. Can you talk about that time somewhat to us, please?
It's kind of interesting though that you say that, because I think some of us that were in the house scene, we would not listen to actually radio music. We would not listen to the mainstream music. It was like in a way, it was like a rebellion in a way. It was like, I think even then we understood like, this is what they're pushing on us. This is what the radio is telling us we should like. This is what, and we were like, no, this is what we like. This music here, So it's kind of interesting. I mean, of course, there was always stuff that was great that we would like. I mean, even the rap thing, I mean, there was hip house. There was a lot of there were dance tracks back in the day that had a rap over them rather than somebody singing. So there was that, kind of melding of the two. There was that kind of crossover of the two at one time. So hip hop and house were developing at the same time. But to some extent, I would be honest and say in the classism sort of way, there were a lot of us who looked at some hip hop as like, oh, that's going back to black exploitation or something like that. That's like, you know, that's pulling us back down. That's what white people want to see of us or something like that. So there was a little bit of you know, kind of an insulation of what we were into, you know, as far as the music we liked, you know.
And the separation too. I would like to speak to that too, in the sense of, as well as our culture was building, there was a street culture, a thug culture that was building. And we often were seeking separation from that as well. That while they were listening to more mainstream music and more steppers culture and that sort of thing, that started to be the division. And you could see by how someone dressed. If they were dressed in Levi's and penny loafers with a, you know, Izod or a polo shirt on, you could tell that they were preppy and more likely belonging to the house culture side. And if you looked at a guy and he had on Lee jeans, which is funny, the difference in the brands, right? Lee jeans and Bucks and some type of generic, you know, shirt or something like that, then they were probably more leaning towards thug culture and gang culture and street culture.
Well, you know, what's interesting for me is that in New York, because there was this celebration of hip hop, because it was a New York music form, there wasn't this kind of I mean, there were obviously adults who had a pejorative view of hip hop, you know what I'm saying? But hip hop was being celebrated as youth music so much, so it had a mainstream audience in WKTU. You would hear sometimes on BLS, and what's ironic is that house music was not the music you would hear in the radio in New York that much. You would have to go to the clubs to listen to. But ironically, with the radio music, you would hear more was more hip hop and more regular R&B. But house was a kind of set for those of a particular taste.
That was how it was here in Chicago.
Yeah,
I mean, here it was the same way here in Chicago. I mean, the mainstream was starting to embrace hip hop. It was the same way.
Well,
you know, but
I'd have to challenge that a little bit, Jerry, in the sense that
well,
nobody challenges Jeremiah.
You know, sorry,
hip hop. It happens.
He's back now.
Don't ever challenge hip hop.
Hold on, my do not disturb is
keep my name out your mouth. Why do you think that is, though, guys?
Hold on, just a second.
Yeah, get your everything right, Eric. Why do you guys think that is? Why do you think that hip hop becomes? And I'm not trying to have any conspiracy. I know no one here believes in conspiracy. The man wanted hip hop to destroy the youth. Like, why do you think hip hop music is being played more than what I would think would be something more radio friendly and dancey?
I mean, you didn't want to start a conspiracy, but I think that it was the industry. You know, to some extent, you can talk about the disco demolition, and that disco was growing, and it was actually starting to take over pop culture, but there was a growing subculture of the suburban kid that, that wasn't embracing it, So that backlash that disco demolition kind of represents was them telling the industry, hey, we don't support this. This is woke. This is,
we're not in people's music.
Right. And if you look at it, if you see the industry, you'll see that almost overnight, the industry changed. Disco died in the music industry, and they started looking at other things to promote. And hip hop became the thing to promote, sort of like, okay, well, if we're going to promote black music, we're promoting that. We're not going to promote the house, even though they're growing at the same time. We're not going to promote house because house sounds too much like disco to us, and we know that disco is kind of toxic right now.
But you know what's funny that you say that? Me and a friend were talking years ago on tour, and we were talking about an early Metallica record, their first record, Kill 'Em All. And one thing he says about the record, he goes, you can dance to that first Metallica record because they're playing 4 on the floor beats, because dance music and disco is still somewhat popular in clubs.
Right.
And if you want to get people out to see your show, you need 4 on the floor. So if you listen to a song like Jump in the Fire, that's 4 on the floor.
Or Rolling Stones Miss You.
Yes.
Right, stuff like that. We would play that stuff. Yeah. You know?
And even if you listen to, because Toussaint and I were talking about this the other day, and I don't know how you feel about this, Pascal. If you listen to Thriller, you know, the classic album Thriller, it is the disco influence on those last 2 records, Off the Wall and Thriller, that makes that record classic, because as big as Bad was, you know, 3 years later, that element of that music is gone.
But that's what I'm saying. That element was gone because it was also in the industry. It was kind of like, oh, don't disco anymore. Stay away from that kind of, you know. So they started trying to move towards more of the funk and everything else. Like that was the backlash worked. It really did push disco out of the music industry in a way.
I had a question though I wanted to ask you about disco relative particularly to the 60s movement. As we've talked about several times on this show about the Kerner Commission report that exposes that in a section called the Negro in Media, that an agenda to flood media with black images was a federal agenda to neutralize the militancy of the movement. Is it possible that the rise of disco in the early 70s is part of that same agenda? In other words, you fuel this kind of dance-friendly entertainment, and you stop people talking about the wretched of the earth and Black Power and Burn Baby Burn. In other words, do you see a possible correlation with the same agenda where they talk about Soul Train, Good Times, and more black radio spaces and more black representatives and news media, which is literally what we get correlated from the Kerner Commission report and the rise of this overly saturated dance music that comes out of the 70s. What do you think? What are your thoughts, Jeremiah?
I could see that. I could definitely see that because, you know, when you look at things like how I heard something about how Nixon had tried to use black businesses to promote
black capitalism.
Black capitalism, exactly. And maybe in a way at the time, disco was growing because there was an effort to promote black music in a way. And that was the direction that it was going. Soul was going into disco. And at the time, there may have been that direction that it was going. So I definitely could see that as a possibility, that that's what was happening. You know, that there was that effort within the industry to promote that. And it was growing. And it was actually taking over pop music. If you look at that time, you could see disco was really taking over pop music. But then there was the backlash. The suburban, you know, and they killed it like that.
What was the class makeup of those early disco audiences, if you will? What was the kind of who was that music appealing to? Was it really just a kind of gay urban scene? Was it a Latino scene? I remember one time we had you on the show, Jeremiah, and you were talking about disco was a kind of meeting of civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the women's rights movement, and the Black is Beautiful movement, all flourishing together in the club dance scene.
Well, the thing I had talked about before, one of the things I saw a documentary about Dizzy Gillespie, and he was talking about, it was like a night in Cuba. He was featuring some other musicians. He was talking about how he kind of talked about his idea of the origin of disco. And he was saying how in New York, you would have like Spanish Harlem. They would do their thing, you know, their music one way. Harlem, you know, Black Harlem would have their things a certain way, another thing, music, you know, soul music. That's where their music was going. And there was always kind of a separation between the two. But Dizzy was saying that a lot of the jazz musicians who were kind of reaching out, trying to get Afrocentric, trying to find their roots, things like that at the time, they started realizing, wait a minute, those are our cousins over there. And, you know, we come from the same background. I mean, slavery, the boats took us all to the Caribbean and then split us up. Some of us went north, some of us went south. But we all came from that. In the South, they were able to keep the culture. We got stripped, you know, so we grew up. I mean, in America, we kind of didn't know our African culture, our African background history, whatever you want to call it. So the when the jazz musicians started realizing that the Afro-Latins had a lot more connection to our African culture, they started reaching out to that. And then you started having this mixture of the Black and Latino cultures together, Afro-Latino. And disco was actually, if you look at some of that, that early disco culture, that was it. That was like, now there were clubs for both groups that that partied together, and that was kind of like the diaspora rejoining or something like that. I don't know how to describe it. I'm sure you can find a better term than I can, but yeah. So I think that was a part of. I mean, well, I guess trying to go into like I'm trying to think of like where as far as class or anything else goes. I think it was really like a working middle class thing originally. It was
Right.
like, disco was that thing that everybody went out to the club to party after work and everything like that. So originally it was working class kind of origin.
Saturday Night Fever. Saturday
Yeah.
Night Fever.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about, because Eric, Smooth, you covered it well, how we get from 70s disco to house music. But do you have any particular narratives of explanations of how disco gets transmuted into this thing called house music that can explain the process?
Oh yeah, I lived it. I lived it. So this is my take on it, right? My take on it is that as the Hot Mix 5 got more and more popular around the city, right? So that started to envelop everyone, right? So there were records that were common to all sides of the city, because Chicago's very segregated. You have to take that into account. Very segregated city. So there were songs that were popular amongst all sides of the city. And as Jerry alluded to, we as a core group always look to go outside of whatever the main. If everybody else is doing this, we want to be doing that, and as a way of separating ourselves. And just the continuation of that is these records that were popular just amongst us, just our music as we claimed it, right? Started getting popular with everyone. We wanted even a deeper separation. So enter the popularity of Ron Hardy, right? So Ron Hardy comes on the scene, and Ron Hardy, one of his to me, part of his brand was that he played everything, right? And especially he played obscure disco breaks or obscure disco songs. So he would play a song that was off the beaten path, and it would be just the vamp of that song. Like, so an example of that is Isaac Hayes' I Can't Turn Around. The vamp of that song was so popular that the end part of it, when the band went into the groove part, that song was huge on our scene, but maybe not so much if you were playing a white party on the north side, right? And as a result of that, our A-list DJs then started having to play similar to Ron Hardy. In fact, we transitioned from a turntablist kind of hip hop influenced tricks environment where we were taking songs and doing backspins and repeats and scratching and that sort of thing, to just really focusing on programming and the transitioning from song to song. And that then became a subtle competition, because we were still competitive, of course, that we had to keep a certain level of energy. And one of the other points with Ron Hardy was because of his partaking in the party favors, he was known to play a lot faster than normal, right? So there was an energy to his sets because he was playing the song 2 or 3, 4 notches, on a 1200, right, over what we would be playing it. So there was an energy to it too. Anyway, in order to match Ron's energy, there started becoming these edits and all these different things of old disco records, that disco became a lot more prominent in our scene than it was prior. in terms of these older records, these records because ironically enough, when the scene first started, most of the records that we were playing were just coming out. So we were playing Let's Go Dancing when it first came out. We were playing uh, Beat the Street and on all of these records when they first made their debut. Fine and
West
NBO.
End Prelude and all of those labels. Yeah.
Yeah, we weren't as much playing, old disco records. That became more of a phenomenon after, I would say, when the Ron Hardy wave started to take a hold.
And, you're bringing so many memories to my mind of this such great music, because there's so many disco songs that are just straight house classics. Like you think of Dr. Love, First Choice. All of their songs, those are disco songs, but a lot of people look at them as house classics. Let no man put us under.
But Let No Man Put Us Under is a perfect example. So at the height of that popularity, here comes Jeff Pettibone. So Let No Man Put Us Under was played. It wasn't as popular on our scene to the Shep. Then like super popular mainstream. As a result of that, and this is where house parallels hip hop very much, is we just play the break of that, right? At in to now we're going to put the bass line, play the bass line, Let No Man Put Us Under, over a track, and just play that break part. That is one of the part of the rubric of house music. I've been trying to slide it. What house music, right?
You're breaking up a little bit, Eric. Is there anybody else hearing
Yeah, we
break
are.
up?
How about that? Is it better now? Is it better?
Yeah, your voice your voice was in and out a little bit there.
Okay, is it better now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now we can
Okay.
hear you.
So what I was saying is that the parallel to hip hop is the disco break, right? And we would take that disco break and recreate that in a very simplistic way. And I've been trying to establish that there's a rubric to house music, and that's one of the rubrics, is that early on it was based on a disco record from the culture, from the culture, but played in a simplistic way with the synthesizer, whereas before it was played with live drums and a live bass and a more sophisticated.
Right.
We took the core elements because that brought the energy, recreated that drum pattern on a drum machine, and then took the bass line, and that was the basis for a lot of the early house music. I mean, the first tracks were based on this concept.
I always compare it like with hip hop, like you were just saying, because hip hop focused on like the downbeat breaks.
Yes.
And Cool Herc said it. He was like, they went crazy over the breaks in the record and he noticed that. So he ended up just starting to play the breaks. He wouldn't even play the rest of the record. He ended up just playing the breaks. We did the same thing in house music, but it was with the disco breaks. It was like we found those. Originally, we couldn't sample, so we would just replay them on drum machines. We would try to recreate it with the drum machines and sequences. Eventually, we started sampling. But the early sampling days, like he was talking about, was the re-edits. So we would take a disco track and they would do re-edits. Sometimes, with cassette tape and re-edit the track, and that was that would be your secret weapon as a DJ. You'd have a certain edit or something like that you could play that nobody else had or something. So that was the parallel with hip hop and house. It was that we were both just using the breaks of the records that were popular for us. But hip hop took more of the downbeat funk breaks, and we took the disco breaks, and disco and house basically evolved that way, taking the disco breaks and turning them into a new style of music, the same way hip hop did.
Can you guys talk about the importance of Frankie Knuckles and Larry Levan to the development of house music?
I would say, go ahead, Eric.
Well, I would jump in and say, right, okay, let me preface this. If you speak against Frankie, you might as well just blackball. So I'm not speaking against Frankie. In fact, I love Frankie. Frankie was a great mentor. I was part of Def Mix at one time. So I have my credit there in place to be able to then critique on the other side and say that Frankie was a huge influence, but you have to remember the warehouse was 150, 200 people, right? So how much could he be an influence from that standpoint, right? But he was a huge influence from in myth and legend, so to speak, right? But one thing that people don't speak on, and there's a balance here, so I'm going to establish the balance too, is the early genre of house music Frankie didn't necessarily play. Except for, here's the thing, right? So as soon as you say that, there's an except for. Obviously, Jamie Principle came from the power plant and from Frankie, right? Jamie's record, all but because it wasn't pressed first, was the first house record. And hands down, it was the first house, quote unquote, recording, right?
Your love, right?
Yeah. And then there was a drum track associated with it that actually I found out Greg Gray actually did the programming on it. So his name is never mentioned, right? He programmed the 909. There's a drum track that was associated with it that just took Adrian Jett's vocal over it and kind of just over, superimposed it over that drum track. That was another popular power plant track that then eked out into, our atmosphere, so to speak. So, in essence, Frankie, by the press, by all intents and purposes, got placed at the head of the table, so to speak, for house music. But in reality, Farley was probably a bigger influence and a bigger distributor of the sound, and it's purely from platform. Farley had the platform. Farley was playing for millions of people at once. Not only was he playing for parties with the teens and playing for Mendel parties and just the larger parties, the platform. He had the playground where he's playing for 1,500, 3,000 kids every weekend, right? He also had the radio where he's playing for millions. So when you think about it, if anything, they should share that head of the table place. But Farley's influence is not as just focused on and pronounced as well as it should be, as much as it should be.
MC, you want
well,
to
I was gonna.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Jeremiah, please go ahead.
And yeah, to add to that, I mean, I think that we got to look at Frankie as kind of like the figurehead. It was like when we talk about how we were trying to do different from the mainstream at the time. I mean, the whole term house comes from the fact that if somebody DJ got on the decks at a party and started playing mainstream music, somebody might go up to them and say, "Don't play that. Play something like they play at the house. Play some house music. Play some warehouse music." And what he really meant was like, play the disco stuff. Play that stuff. And that was an influence. So that's where the term house really got popularized in Chicago, was because that's what we were talking about, saying like, don't go mainstream, let's this disco vibe, let's keep that going and keep it alive. But when it came to actually turning it into our own style of music, Eric is right, Farley had a lot more of an influence on creating the style than Frankie did. Frankie was like the figurehead. He was like the lead of our direction. This is where we want to go, But when it comes to actually the creation of the music, you could look at Farley and Steve Hurley that we worked with, as being more so the architects, really more of how the sound really got created.
Right. Except for, because there's always relate to this big time, right? Frankie's mix of "It's Not Over" was a huge impact on us, because it was one of the first times that we got to recognize that Frankie was bigger than Chicago. Seeing him on that remix, his remix was kind of the B-side of the Shep Pettibone mixes, and so that also established house from a culture standpoint, and certainly from a musical standpoint too. As much as he was using the existing first choice instrumentation, he certainly mixed it in a warehouse way.
The last time you were on, Jeremiah, you recommended a documentary called Pump Up the Music.
Pump Up the Volume.
Pump Up the Volume. I'm so sorry. Pump Up the Volume, which I enjoyed very much. But I learned a lot about techno, which was coming up at the same time. So how does techno figure into the scene? Who were the people who were listening to techno? And do you feel responsible for the popularity of techno as well?
I would say, well, if you in those documentaries, one of the things you'll see a lot, Derek May is like he's so good at promotion. He's so good at telling his story, and I think that's really what made it popular. He's really good at like telling a story of techno and gave it a character that helped for it to grow. But he would say that he was coming to Chicago. He was coming to the warehouse, the power plant, and a lot of those guys would come to Chicago to party. And they, you know, they got influenced by the scene. But then they went back to New York. There's another documentary I saw recently that really gets a lot more into explaining how Detroit kind of went its own way. And, you know, they were sort of influenced by dance music the same way we were. And they were moving into the technological use of, you know, drum machines and keyboards and stuff like that, same way we did. But they kind of embraced another sound. It's like we were still trying to imitate disco records in a way. And they kind of decided to just go off into a whole different thing. Maybe they're influenced like a lot more by some of the early electronic music like Kraftwerk and some of the other groups like that. And those guys kind of carved their own way. It was like, well, I mean, in a way, it was almost like, well, Chicago's already doing that. We're going to go this way, you know. And they, you know, they did a great job. I mean, and like I said, Derek was really good at giving it a narrative, you know. He would, like the story in that documentary, I think he said that for him, techno was like what would happen if you put Kraftwerk and George Clinton together in the elevator with a synthesizer and left them in there for a while. And then when you open it up back later, there was, you know, come out with all the smoke and then the music that was created from that, you know, from that meeting, you know, that's what they were saying techno was, you know.
I have a question because you guys are saying that there was a heavy New York influence in that art scene, which is kind of a beautiful time if you think about that mid 80s moment, even if you're a fan of a lot of the pop art. I know MT as our resident art snob is not a fan of disposable pop art of that era.
What did you think of Basquiat, MT?
Oh, do you wanted to ask?
I'm not a huge Basquiat fan. I'm just not. I like Lichtenstein. I like some Warhol. But Basquiat, I understand some of the theory behind it. It just doesn't move me.
Right.
Because she wasn't jacking her body. But if you're not jacking your body, what do you really know?
But in a way, I mean, he is sort of an avatar to me for the house scene to some extent at the time. You know, it was like that whole thing of him being this black kid that was penetrating the downtown scene. You know, in a way, that was sort of a similar aesthetic, the similar idea that we were looking at, like trying to be different, trying to be out of the mainstream, trying to be underground. You know, that was, you know, similar to our goal in a way, or our, you know, what we were looking to do.
And I wanted to ask you, how does that same art scene get into the European scene and kind of turn into what we call trip hop? Because from Basquiat to Banksy, there's a direct line. There's a through line, and those same people that were influenced by the 80s hip hop scene were also influenced by the art coming out from that scene as well. And in the UK, in Bristol, you have something really interesting bubbling over there that is, you know, in the early 90s, it's called trip hop. How do you think house music or the scene you guys are building in the States influences that sound as well?
I'll jump in.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Eric. Yeah, your turn.
I'll just add Jerry is definitely more study on this, and I think probably the first person Massive Attack was brought to my attention was by Jerry. I would say that to me, it's the freedom of white people meeting the soul of Black people, and that their ability to express themselves musically outside of a box is where these things come to fruition. And then the Black people who participate with them, and maybe even the Black people that originated, but because we're in such of a box in terms of the way that we can write, the way that we can express ourselves musically, that then the white boys, if you will, then take it to a mainstream or a mainstream underground, if you will, that blows it up, so to speak, because they don't have the ceilings that we have. They don't have the expectation that you either got to be making a party song, a love song, or an out of love song. A barn, and it really be just about the barn.
Well, it's really interesting because as I'm doing research on this project, and I'm kind of stuck in this dance music world, and I'm reading about is it Cole and Clavillis, who most people know as CNC. Did you guys know those cats?
Yeah, I did.
They don't get the same disdain that Frank Farian gets for Milli Vanilli, but they did it not once, but twice, or 3 times, either that I know of.
Right.
You guys might know about it more.
What they did with,
where they have they create a group called Seduction, but it's really just, was it Martha Wash?
Martha Wash, right?
Some tracks. They're like, okay, we'll get these chicks to model and sing the songs, but they're not really singing. How common is that even in your genre? Because as Pascal and I said, early before we got on, we don't even know who the singers are in a lot of this house stuff. A lot of it's sampled. I don't remember if it was Cole. There was a different producer, right, that also sampled Layla Hathaway and ended up getting sued. Or was it Cole and Clavillis? Because they were involved in a lot of these.
You mean Lolita Holloway?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah. Hathaway, Holloway, some Black woman. Was it them that sampled her, or was it someone different?
There were a lot of people that sampled Lolita. I mean, she had a couple big records in the South. So I mean, Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. I mean, their big hit was Such a Good Vibration.
Yeah.
That was Lolita Holloway. She was one of the most sampled out there. But then there was that whole, I guess there was the whole thing of the appeal of some of the singers. I mean, a lot of these singers that were singing on these house records were, Black women in their 30s or 40s that weren't quite the supermodel look, and so the industry, as far as trying to push those as artists, the industry wasn't really trying to do that. So when you look at something like CNC and what they did was they were like, well, we can't have the group with Martha out front. So they put some models and, and actors out as the group, and that wasn't that common. I mean, they decided to do it, but most of the time it wasn't that common, which may explain why some of the music stayed obscure, because there was no way to promote it. There was not that, when you try to go mainstream, you got to put together the whole package. You got to have the artist image and everything else. And they found that it was hard to promote some of these women that were singing the songs, the way the industry typically would look at how they promote them.
And let me ask you two guys this question about authenticity, right? Because when we think about these quote scandals, and I don't see them as scandals at all. If you like the song, you like the song. It's not like this news came out, because Martha Wash, if you're old enough to remember this, again, I wasn't recording this kind of music at this time. I'm going into little bitty bedroom studios trying to do stuff in my life when this is going on. And we got a 4-track. But you would pay, like you said, you'd pay the gospel singer, because that's kind of what everybody wants. They want that
Right.
big black gospel voice over these quote disco tracks, because that's kind of what disco is to some extent, right? And it doesn't cost you that much. You get the models to lip sync really cheap. Maybe you get a hit for a couple months in some European countries, and you move on and do the next thing. In the early 90s, these songs were really catching fire. You know, Milli Vanilli, I don't want to say it's a new sound, but this is an underground sound as well, where you're mixing kind of techno-y, R&B-ish, disco-y stuff with hip-hop with the group Newmark. That's who is singing. Girl, You Know It's True is a single in 1987 in Baltimore.
Right. The producer found Frank Farian found those people
and
had
found them,
do the
and
whole.
you know, the rest is that history. And so it's not like the original people who did release a record called The Real Milli Vanilli after they returned their Grammy. It doesn't sell, doesn't even chart. And then it's not like everybody went back to go buy It's Raining Men, and that recharted after Martha Wash had not one but two lawsuits against these producers that actually caused Congress to change a law in copyright where you have to, or music production, where you have to give credit now to singers where they weren't getting credit before. And as you were saying off air, E, in the European context, it's a little more common for them to find the model, you know, Technotronic. The first release is Technotronic featuring Felly, Pump Up the Jam. And it's just a black model trying to dance and lip syncing the song until the Milli Vanilli stuff happens. And by the time they release the American version, they change it to Ya Kid K and yada, yada, yada.
And I worked with Ya Kid K, and the funny thing about it is Ya Kid K is fine as hell. There was really no reason that she couldn't have been the face of the original.
It almost felt like there's a great documentary. It's called The Last Dons, and it's about this American cat and this Italian cat. And the American cat wrote these like Eurovision-esque songs in Italy. And he had a minor hit in Germany himself, and he was a good-looking man. And the label was like, we need a real pretty boy, a young pretty boy. You're 25, you're a little too old. We need a young pretty boy that can dance to do this song, and we're going to name him Den Haro because it sounds like Denaro, like
Johnny Bravo.
Right? And so they get this guy who lip syncs the songs. Years later, the actual American that wrote the songs and sang the songs comes out and says, I'm the real Den Haro. I sang these songs. I recorded the music. It's me. And what I find interesting that we don't see with like the Milli Vanilli or even the CNC Music Factory thing, there's a split from the people that listen to this music. And there's less people that like the actual artist and more people that appreciate the avatar. The mime, he literally signed his contract as the mime. And
you got to look at it. You got to look at it as like that's the industry. I mean, how much music has been affected because that's what the industry decided to push. You know, was it really that popular, or was it just that the industry made an effort saying like, okay, this has a little bit of a buzz here, we're going to really push that, you know? And I mean, as somebody coming up with in house music, I looked at that the same way. I mean, in New York, as Pascal was saying earlier, I mean, hip hop was growing. It was celebrated in New York, and a lot of the industry was in New York. So they said, well, this is what we're going to push. You know, in Chicago, we had house was the same way. It was growing and celebrated on the radio here too, but there wasn't as much of the industry to grab it and say, oh, we can promote this, you know? So house kind of got lost as far as the US goes. And we could even see that happening because some labels did try to get a hold to it. Some labels did try to promote it. I mean, our experiences with CeCe Peniston, you know,
now that's an interesting turning point when you talk about CeCe Peniston and we talk about video, because I think we underestimate the power that video had to change the landscape of music. If you go back and look at #1 hits pop hits of the 80s,
right,
and compare it to what happens in like 83,
right.
music looks so much different. Christopher Cross gone, REO Speedwagon gone, Billy Squire, all this stuff is gone. I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's just different, right?
But who
go ahead.
put the money into making those videos? You know, that was the thing. It's like you're right. When the whole age of video, it was like a new era of promotion for anything like that. It's like, you know, you had to have a video now. If you were going to get popular, you had to have a video. You had to have something out there that was going to promote it, because that's where everything was going. And so but as an artist, you didn't have the money to make your video, so you were relying on the record industry, the record label that you got signed to or whatever, to promote you, to make a video for you. And if the record labels were saying, you know, well, hip hop is what we're going to put money into because what we think is going to be the future. House, that sounds too much like disco. That's not this, you know. That got pushed to the side. CC was an effort to try it, to see if they could push that in the American market, you know.
And it seemed to work. There was 6 singles off that record?
The first record, no, there were 2 albums. There were 3. It's like 3 and 3. So it was like there were 3 off the first album and 3 off the second album.
Okay,
you know,
confusing.
Because I think Keep On Walking that Steve did was maybe Eric can correct me on this, but
you guys did Keep On Walking?
Yeah, Steve Hurley
Hold on,
produced
you
that
guys
too.
did Keep On Walking?
No, we didn't do it.
Okay.
Steve Hurley and somebody else wrote that, but you know, it's part of the production company that we were part of. But Steve and someone else in the company, they wrote that song and he produced it.
Can you explain real quick what you mean about a production company? Because again, when we talk about authenticity of art, you know, using inverted quotes, Toussaint and I were talking about this. No one thinks of Whitney Houston as a performer. She didn't write those songs. She didn't choreograph those dance moves. She wasn't directing those videos. She didn't know how her hair and makeup was supposed to look. Whitney Houston by herself would have been a whole different thing. When we think about pop music, I don't think we think of the teams of people that put this stuff together. So you guys are working with CeCe Peniston. I don't know who signed you. Did you sign her to a production deal or did a label?
No. She was signed to A&M Records, and they came to us looking for stuff. Originally, they actually came to Steve because they wanted him to remix finally. They wanted a better club mix. But at the time, we were starting to realize that we weren't making as much money off of doing remixes, because remix is a one-time thing, you get paid. But if you're writing the songs, then you're publishing royalties. And so we were trying to move into doing that. We were trying to move into getting more publishing royalties going for us. And so we got involved because they came in and Steve said, well, I don't know if I want to remix, but I want to do some stuff for the album. And they said, okay, fine, let's submit some songs. And you know, and one of the songs that he picked was some song that Eric and I had done, We Got a Love Thing, and I think Keep On Walking and some other ones that were, you know, what they picked, you know. So that's how we started working with CC, was that we were pushing to get involved more in the production side of things rather than just remixing and doing a dance remix, you know.
And so when you make that record, which is kind of the perfect mix at the time, because there's a lot of singles coming out, right? Like we talked Robin S., Crystal Waters. This is a time where these housey, dancey, brand new heavies almost had a housey vibe to some of their bigger singles.
Well, that was the thing too, because it was growing in the UK. So the US market, I mean, it's like, if you look at it, like in the documentary, they show you how it started here in Chicago, but then where it really got its exposure as far as the mainstream was not here in the US, it was in the UK. And it started going pop in the UK. I mean, Steve, who we work with, actually had the first house music record that went #1, Jack Your Body. It actually went #1 on the pop charts.
Pascal, he heard it. He heard the word.
Jack Your Body.
He's a jack master.
Is it?
Jack Master Pascal. Jack Master Pascal.
I just want to dance. Check. But when you're putting CeCe's record together, that first record finally with that massive hit that you just couldn't escape, right? Kind of the soundtrack of the early 90s might be Finally and a handful of other dancey songs. You kind of crafted a bit of a house pop soul R&B masterpiece that can't be replicated. No one was able to replicate that sound. Do you think that is a product of the time? Because I will go so far as to say that, to me, what really kills, two things I think kill this genre, and you can disagree. And Adept Pascal, I definitely want to hear what you have to say about this. And you as well, the woman on the show. Two things really, the lawsuits, I think get to people to a certain respect, and pitch correction enables people to do things in the studio that would take so much time with layering. Or maybe three things. And digital recording. Digital recording changes the game. When you don't have to cut tape and you can copy and paste, that's a game changer. I think pitch correction, i.e. auto-tune, is a game changer because dance music just sounds so different now, eliminating those expensive, soulful voices with go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, and that made it easier to make the records. But I think that the thing we were talking about earlier about the whole thing with video and everything else, it's like you had promotion was really important in the music industry, in the 80s. It was just like promoting the artist. And it would really make a difference if a label got behind an artist and decided that they were going to really push them and try to push them into the mainstream and see if it would work. Unfortunately, with something like CeCe Peniston, some of the other, and Robin S. at the time, that's pushed in the U.S. because it was getting so popular in the U.K. that they were like, well, we got to give it a try here. Even though at one time we were kind of against the disco sound and we weren't really pushing that here, we have to see if we can make it work in this market. And and with CeCe, they had, she's cute. They had someone they could put in the video, and they were able to promote it and get it out there. But unfortunately, for a lot of house music artists, there was no artist development, really. There was no labels that were coming in and saying that we're going to make these people into stars. They weren't trying to do that for us at all. There was no incentive. There was nothing like that. They were saying, no, hip hop is the thing we're going to be pushing, and we're going to take them and make them into the stars. There was no effort at all to develop anything from house. In fact, we're talking about, like, I think our approach when we were making the music, it was still like, what was popular at the time was Whitney Houston and Mariah Carey and things like that. And there was still a pop element in Black music to some extent. And when we made the song, we were trying to do that, where it could cross over and, and be in that same genre or same element. But if you look at that at the time, you saw the rise of people like Mary J. Blige, and you saw the whole thing where it was like, oh no, Black music has to go, we got to get the pop out of it. We got to go street now. We got to go back to the street. Even Mariah Carey started changing what she was doing.
Yes.
She stopped trying to do the pop stuff. It was.
But yet Madonna was trying to appropriate house music with Vogue. That song Vogue. She was trying to appropriate that aesthetic.
But would you say appropriate, or would you say she just dug it?
She was trying to profit from it one way or the other.
I mean, but can she?
If you look at Madonna, she was kind of in the club scene in New York.
She was from the club
she
scene.
wasn't like somebody.
Can't she? But I asked the question, and it's not to be like, to push. It's just to ask the question: can she dig it? Because I think she literally dug the music.
No, she comes out the club scene, so I think she did dig the music. When I said appropriate, I'm not trying to say that she stole something that was someone else's.
There are some people who consider her as having stolen.
Yeah,
but it wasn't that. But with Madonna, it was that effort to finally brand it, to make it into something, to promote it, to make it, to take the music and and push it like you would any other mainstream artist, push any other music, that had been missing a lot with a lot of house music. If you look back at it, you
Correct.
know, there was never really that effort to make it into a mainstream thing and push any artist. I mean, well, I would say never any effort, because there was like 10 City, a group here from Chicago. There was an effort to take them. They signed to, I think, Atlantic Records. And and Steve at one time had a label deal. That's how we came together as a production company. He got money from Sony because Jackie Body went to #1. He got money to start his own label. So there were some efforts, and we had a girl named Kim Sims, a woman named Kim Sims that was on, that we were producing basically through our production company. And she had some big records in the UK and Europe. Not so much here in the US because the sound that we were doing wasn't street enough. It was like the industry was definitely
And,
even
and who
telling you
told you
could
that though? Who
the
was it? A
industry
person
you
from
could
the
see.
street?
No, the industry was. That's the funny thing. The industry was telling us like,
Yeah.
well, like this is aren't black music. Isn't black music going that way? Isn't it more street now? What are you
But,
guys
but
getting
isn't
us
that
this stuff?
but isn't that the whole thing about? We were talking about this with E before he bogged out on us. But there's something to be said about the idea of authenticity and what is authentically black, Latin, whatever. And the people
Right.
telling you these things or writing these songs don't look like it's the same thing that the paper that Bertrand wrote, who gets to write for black people. And it's fascinating that this whole conversation we were talking about people that have access to things are the ones that are creating the music that then gets reflected onto a whole people as culture. And it's like you got instruments behind you. You had to learn how to play them.
Mm.
Instruments cost money, having a place to play them. Not everybody can plug in and even play the bass in the house. It's very annoying when someone is learning how to play an instrument. God forbid you want to play the drums. And so you got to have space for all that kind of stuff. And I find a lot of this conversation really kind of refreshing because we get caught up in the capitalist imagination of what authenticity is. And we forget what we can make when there's cross-cultural collaboration in the arts.
But capitalism's effect on how the music is pushed and how it is developed, that's what we're talking about here. I mean, really, it is like the art itself. There was great house music that has never been pushed out there to a wider audience, that has never been promoted, because at the time the music industry did not see it as a viable moneymaker. That's really what it comes down to, the capitalism of it. And so that's something we got to realize, that it's not always about how good your music is. It really does come down to whether or not it's promoted, whether or not the industry gets behind it. And I mean, the great thing about something like YouTube and other things like that is it did kind of start democratizing things, where you had people that you could they put their videos out and they blew up. Like Justin Bieber, I guess, was discovered that way, because he was doing some videos and they blew up. He got like millions of hits, but then a label came along and said, okay, we can take this to the next level, and that's usually what happens with anything in the music business. Artists, would spend years in the clubs playing, and then an A&R guy would come along and say, you guys should be stars. And they would take them, they would develop it, they would, do everything they had to do to promote and turn them into the big stars that they became, and that's always been part of the industry, and to some extent it still is. There's a lot more democratization now, because you can kind of get things going on your own. You can get up on Instagram, you can try to be an influencer, you can, really,
you still have to have a certain level of access and money, right? Like,
exactly.
I agree that, I can, as someone that does, I can release music and it is a fart in the ocean.
Right.
Okay.
Wow. That's really what it becomes, because a very small handful of people are going to hear it or even care to hear it, because I don't have the ability to spend thousands of dollars on YouTube placement, and I don't have the ability to get a publicist that's going to get me in the right playlists and blogs and have someone cut it just perfectly so it can be a TikTok anthem, and actually pay TikTok influencers to make sure they do their video with my song. Like there's still a machine. I think the machine just runs a little
changed.
differently. Yeah,
I mean, we had a different machine when we were doing it.
Mhm.
You know, I wish Eric was here because there's some funny stories about this. But there was a different machine when we were doing it. I mean, we came out of the end of the payola days. You know,
good time. Good times. I need a hit. Here's a suitcase full of money. See,
exactly. And the thing about it is that, I mean, let's just be honest. I don't know how big we would have been or how much success we would have had if it weren't for the fact that we had a manager, it's a guy named Frank Rodrigo, who had come out of that. He knew all. He came out of that. He knew all the guys that, you know, it's funny. I read this one book that I forgot, it was called The Music Masters or something like that. It was like about how the whole Payola scene. And it was funny because a couple of names came up and I was like, oh, I remember Frank talking about those guys, you know? So it was like he knew the people to talk to. We knew the DJs that we would talk to make sure it got on the Billboard 100. You know, it was like the A&R people and other things we were working at the record labels knew who we had to get it to in order to get it charted, you know. And of course, a lot of that probably, you know, of course, it's like, well, they're paying them promotional fees, right? So that was how a lot of the stuff got going, you know. And so we were a benefit of that. We had access, you know. It wasn't just like, you know, to bust the bubble, but I feel like it wasn't just that we were that good. It was that we also had the access.
And that's my point. Music as we know it, when radio becomes a thing that is breaking music, it's not breaking it because some DJ was like, there's this great sound coming out of the Delta. Oh, you gotta hear these colored guys are us. No, there's a briefcase full of money and dope that's dropped off to a DJ, and you're told to break records in markets, and that's the way it was done. The popular music as you know it. And even if you say, I am not about popular, blah, 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 even that was contrived.
Now, let's not bust the bubble totally.
Okay.
You had to take a record that was good. You kind of had to take the record that was getting popular somewhere and you could blow it up. You couldn't take a shit record and try to blow it up like that. You know, it was like, no, it didn't work, you know, no matter how much you paid. So you had to take a good record. Right. People did try, right. and you would see the results. So you could see that it didn't work. But the thing is that, but if there's 100 good records out there, you know, and only 10 of them can get pushed, there's 90 records that are gone and forgotten to time, you know, that could have been promoted and pushed, but because they didn't have the access and promotion, it didn't happen, you know. And I feel like that's the same thing that happened to house music in America. You know, in Europe, it was blowing up. That's why it got away from us, you know, because it was a black genre of music. It started that way. But the industry decided, black music, that's hip hop, right? Hip hop is black music. Where, you know, what this stuff sounds like disco. We're not into that. You know, the decision was really more so of how the industry people were thinking than how the audiences were thinking. You know, I believe that if they would have pushed house music out there more, there would have been a wider audience. They would have been able to promote it. But there was never, keep saying never. There was an effort to do it, and it had some limited success. But hip hop was such a behemoth growing at the same time that it was just simpler.
Do you think part of the pivot, and I do want to, before I ask this question, I want to address the super chat. Have any of you seen that Dr. Cornel West is creating a house album called House of West? No joke. I did not know that.
Oh, wow.
Jackie West, Jackie
Oh,
West.
okay. You know what? Hey, Parker, thank you very much for the super chat, Parker. But can you send a message to Cornell West to watch this show then and be like, hey, these cats is talking about house
Yeah,
music.
dude. Cornell, call me.
Yeah, he needs production team. We got the CC Penison's production team in here. Do you think, but I want to ask you, do you think the pivot to hip hop is helped due to the fact that they don't need the same machine that you need in pop music to make a hit record?
No, I think they used the same machine. Hip hop blew up.
But
because
I mean,
they
look,
used
you don't
the same
need
machine.
you don't need to spend $30,000 on hair.
The production of it, right?
That's
The
what I mean.
production of it, right? Yeah, the production of it was like it was a street thing. So it was like, oh, okay, cool. We don't have to spend it because
No
the whole
live
look,
instrumentation.
the whole look is to go for that, you know. And the industry was happy about that because they were like, oh, we can cut back on our expenses. You know, we can cut back on what we need to spend on artists. Oh yeah, I mean, to me, I feel like to some extent we got to look at that as why certain genres will blow up. And I really believe that house would have been an expensive genre to try to push artists because you would have still had to do it in the way that they did pop artists. But hip hop was easier.
Way easier. And I want to ask you that as a person, again, you have live instruments behind you. So I'm sure you're like, I can't get that sound on this synth. I'm gonna bring the bass in. You know, I don't have the right amp on this. Can you guys go, especially if you're like an SIR or some studio with a wall of stuff? No, bring me this pedal. I want to try it out. You can mess around with tones for a week and a half trying to get the right tone that you want for 2 seconds of a song. And when you read about bands like Steely Dan when they're recording something like Asia, again, groups that got eliminated during the video era, and you read about how long it took them. One of the guitar players said it took me 6 weeks to find a chair that I liked to sit in to record. So as rock music becomes pop music, and when I say rock, I mean R&B, the original music. As it blows up, these guys start having more requests. They become bigger divas. They want to explore more musically, and it just becomes a costly endeavor that eventually, in the mid '70s, reaps some rewards with live music. But because of economic downturns across the board, the record industry kind of hits a bit of a slump in the 80s.
Right.
And this pivot towards these cats that can make music without, hiring 50,000 musicians.
Very similar to punk, right?
Yeah. Right. The simplicity. How much of it is really like, oh man, this is really the music that spoke to a generation, and how much of it is also, look, it was just more cost effective.
Are we saying that hip hop
exactly
the perfect music for neoliberalism?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's the thing that's the thing about it. It's not, I'm not trying to hate on it so much, but being someone that was in the industry at the time, it just always bothered me a little bit. Like, I'm not saying hip hop should have never been, as big as it is, but when you see how the industry, we were always talking to A&R people. We were trying to give them demos and other things to put on artists and other stuff like that. So when you see behind the scenes, when you kind of get to know that you see the trends, you see that, they want to spend less, and now hip hop is the better way to do it. It's less glamour to it. It's less this, less that. So it's a cheaper genre to do. And of course, a lot of these labels didn't want to spend that much money on black music anyway. So it was convenience.
Yeah.
So So coming from someone who was in a competing genre, it could sound like I'm hating, but I just see that it wasn't that one was definitely better than the other. It was that there was the effort more made by the industry to push hip hop to blow up. And the other thing too is that even within hip hop, you can see the differences. When hip hop really started out, it was a hipster kind of thing. It was like college. It was like something that started getting popular with white college kids, like the Ari Melber types.
Braggadocio.
What'd you say, Pascal?
It was all about braggadocio. It wasn't like the whole criminal crime as an aesthetic does not start with hip hop. Does not start with crime as an aesthetic. It starts about urban braggadocio. It's like I'm the man. I can get the fly ladies and all that kind of. It's about braggadocio.
And even when it started getting into the, the woke stuff, if we want to say that, when Public Enemy started, and there were groups like Poor Righteous Teachers, even when it got into that stuff, what was interesting was that there was a group of, white college kids that actually liked it. They grew, they actually promoted it. And in a way, that's what made hip hop blow up. I mean, in some of the we talk about the whole downtown scene in New York. Hip hop really blew up because they started going down to the clubs like CBGB's. They would start inviting hip hop DJs down there to play with the punk shows. So during the, so they have a hip hop DJ during the punk shows. And that's how it started crossing over into the mainstream.
Def Jam is the product of that synergy.
Oh man, there's something very chic.
Ruben.
Okay, look, check it. Here's one for you guys, and we got the OGs on the screen. A movie like Less Than Zero, where Rick Rubin does the score.
Yeah,
literally has
Brett
what
Easton
Pascal
Ellis
is talking about. Extremely rich people,
right?
Listening to, on one hand, there's a scene where they walk into a club that's playing Red Hot Chili Peppers, and I mean early Chili Peppers when George Clinton's producing them, and then they, in that same scene, then you all of a sudden you hear Run DMC.
Yeah,
I think Going Back to Cali might even be on that soundtrack. So, there is something to be said about the chicness of hip hop mixed with, punk.
Who are the tastemakers? Who
are the tastemakers, right?
Exactly. But I was saying, even within hip hop, you could see the change too. Originally, it was it was more conscious things that were actually blowing up the artist. It was like I said, Public Enemy became really big, but to some extent, there was a certain audience that were still uncomfortable with what Public Enemy was saying, So the hipsters could really get into it, on the downtown scene, and they were into that. That was fine for them. But their suburban cousins were kind of still uncomfortable with this stuff. So then what happens? Along comes gangster rap. Now, gangster rap makes it more comfortable for them to like it. It's a style that's, just talks about the streets, and it's a escapism. It's I mean, don't get me wrong. I think NWA, their first album, is a work of art. I feel like they established the genre because it was different. It was something that really spoke to gave voice to something that did not have a voice before.
Yes.
But then the industry kind of used that to pivot everything towards that when it came to black music. I mean, Eminem would even say, like, hey, I have the freedom. Eric was saying something about this before. There's one difference I have to some extent in the industry is I have the freedom to say what I want to say and do what I want to do. Black artists, you kind of told, oh no, man, you got to be more street. You got to be more this. You got to be more that. I mean, De La Soul. That it's kind of interesting. You see their evolution. You see, like, in some of their later albums, they were even you could notice that they were trying to be more street, which is not their thing, but you could tell that the industry was pushing, well, this is popular now, the street thing, you got, eventually they didn't catch on, they couldn't go that way, and the street stuff got bigger, so they were dropped, And
Tucson, what do you you're a hip hop fan and you have roots in the industry. What do you say about this?
I feel like the more I learn about house, not just liking it, but the more I learn about it, the more I dislike hip hop.
Interesting. Why is that?
It's hard to say, but I do find that a lot of people who get disenchanted with hip hop say that they're going into dance music.
I see a lot of people now. A lot of parties here in Chicago. There was a growing hip hop scene here too, and there's a lot of DJs who came up, like, they're 10 and 20 years younger than me, who were trying to play hip hop. But what's interesting now is a lot of them only play hip hop from the 90s and house.
Yeah.
You know, it's like that's where it is. Because there even a lot of people like Eric and I were talking about, we were kind of resistant to hip hop at first. Because like I said, we kind of felt like it was a push by the mainstream to push black people music this way, especially us being in the industry and seeing that. We kind of felt like, yeah, this is pushing us in this direction, and that's the industry doing it. It's not us, and we're not going to just follow, you know. So in a way, house music was our rejection of that, and it's really interesting when you look at that. But it was these bougie kids that were doing that instead of following the mainstream, you know. But a lot of us did start turning on to hip hop when we started hearing Public Enemy and De La Soul and Tribe. We were just like, okay, wait a minute. Okay, well, there's something in this hip hop that we can relate to. You know, yeah, okay. And we started getting into it too. You know, but at first we were very resistant. But that did turn our heads too, you know. But then you saw very quickly, that lasted like maybe 5 or 6 years in the industry. Very quickly it turned. And it changed, and the industry, you know, turned it into everything had to go gangster and street, you know. So, yeah.
Pascal, you look like you want to say something.
I think this has been a very rich conversation, but one of the things I really want to realize is that who are the singers from 10 City? Do you remember the singers from 10 City?
Byron Stingley. Byron Stingley was the singer.
From Chicago?
Yep.
I always wondered who he was, because I remember the conversation we were having about who are the singers of the actual group. I remember the name of the group of that actual group, because they were putting out some of my favorite house music tracks in the mid to late 80s, but I never knew the name of the actual singers. And they were very popular. They were obviously a gay group, but they had some amazing music. They were not gay?
They weren't. No.
But they
that's
actually.
That's the thing. That's the mistake. It's like, I'm not trying to disparage it or trying to cut any cleavage between the gay scene or whatever, but house was not just a gay thing. You know, it was just like there was very much an influence, but it was very much an influence from Warehouse and everything else. But 99% of the artists that actually made the music were not. You know, because
they had a very, I wouldn't say
flamboyant.
Yeah, not what they had, like some lipstick and whatnot. It seemed that they were.
Well, that was the marketing. That was the video. That was the video stylist.
It wouldn't have changed my opinion of them as musicians. I love the music either way, but I just mistakenly thought that a couple of guys in the group were.
Yeah, Byron is definitely straight and has like 10 kids.
I want to. So we talk about authenticity.
One of his son actually played for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Byron Stingley Jr. was actually a lineman for the Steelers for a little while.
I do want to also bring this up when we talk about like hip hop and authenticity, because there's something interesting that Jeremiah is bringing up, and that is when hip hop is coming out, and after it has success throughout the 80s, it's still not really pop music, right? It's still kind of in a certain box of quote black music. And a lot of people are interviewed about, what do you think about this new phenomenon with the coloreds? And a lot of famous rock musicians and even some black musicians were always like, it's not music. This isn't music. It's not going to stand the test of time. Jerry Garcia is in a somewhat well-known interview. If you're a big music fan, you probably have seen this interview where he goes, it can't grow. I don't know where the music can go, because this is all they can do with it. And when MTV launches Yo MTV Raps, which isn't the first rap show, BET had one before, but when MTV launches Yo MTV Raps, later on they launch Unplugged, which is, are you tired of this electronic stuff? Are you tired of the lip syncing? Because remember the whole Milli Vanilli lip syncing thing happens. Not so much them getting outed, but the tape skipping. Then Janet Jackson had a tape skip. So the whole thing is like, oh, everybody's lip syncing. Well, we're going to break it down and give it to you to the roots. And this is real music. This is authentic music. No one's plugged in. They're unplugged. I found it fascinating that MTV is going to hit both markets at the same time and feel nothing. We'll give you your hip hop because we can't deny it, but also we'll be the channel of authenticity.
The Roots actually did a really good. You said the Roots, the group,
Mhm.
the Roots actually did a very good unplugged,
Mhm.
an unplugged episode. Yeah,
Yes.
they did a live thing there too.
De
Yeah.
La Soul did a
Mhm.
did a unplugged episode. That was
There were
De
a
La
couple of-
Soul, the whole Native Tongues actually.
There are a couple of
Yeah.
hip hop groups that really excelled in the
Mhm.
unplugged genre
Oh,
on MTV.
Hello, Cool J
I mean-
did well too.
He was on that same one.
yeah,
On
yep.
the De La-
There's a lot. Like I said, I'm not trying to diss hip hop in any way. I feel like there's a lot of artists out there who could be developed, hip hop, house, or whatever, but who are not because of the capitalism of it. That there is still that how much that has an effect on what gets pushed or not in the industry is something people have to pay more, that people should be more aware of. It's
Mhm.
like how much we're sold things, how much we're sold, artists, and they're pushed out there, and some things start growing organically, and that's the great part about it, is that there still are artists out there who come along and they just catch on and they grow organically, and that's still a possibility. That's the way it used to be, but now it's so easy to push an artist, to package it the right way and sell it, and to me that to some extent that's what explains so much of where the industry has gone now with hip hop to some extent.
Well, Tucson, you want to answer? Because I have one last question, and I want you to hit this super chat before I ask this last question.
Sure. DC Joe Black asks or says,
What'd you say?
what?
Joe Black ass?
Asks.
Oh,
I would not
did
just
you
throw
see
that
your
in for
black
no
ass? That's
reason. No. DC Joe Black says, house music speaks to some internationalism. DJs Ron Trent, Timmy Registered, Theo
Registered, yeah.
Parrish, etc., enjoy wider recognition and money in Japan and Europe, thanks TIR.
Thank you, Joe Black ass.
Yeah, I mean that's what helped us survive. I mean, we didn't have much of a life here in the States, but the fact that it did blow up in the UK first and then started spreading across Europe actually allowed a lot of us to make a living, to start DJing, going over there to play. The music, there's still a lot of us who can make our careers in the industry because we reach out to the international spaces. That's what we have to do, in order to make it. And that's always been part of house music. Unfortunately, though, because there hadn't been the support, one of the great things about hip hop was that when there had been an effort to take over hip hop, it started out in the hood, basically, black music, everything. There had been an effort, but co-opted, start having more white hip hop artists and everything like that. And hip hop was really good at saying, hold up, this is a black thing, and that kept the center on black artists, Unfortunately, with house music, we were a lot more open, international. Our music was based on so many different, things coming together, that to some extent we opened up the door to our own demise in a way. It was like our own exclusion, because it's like, okay, well, everybody can do this. Well, now, you started getting all these DJs in the UK pop up, and now they're making millions of dollars. And a lot of us are barely making thousands, So that, there is a market for it. I mean, somebody put out, one magazine put out a list of the top 40 DJs and the salaries that they made last year or something like that. And the top DJ was like Calvin Harris or something like that. And he made like 40 million, of that top 40 list, none of them were black. None.
I believe it.
The next, there was a what they call it, the other list, like what they call it when they have an extra list, like the mention list, or
Honorable
they
mention or
have
something.
honorable mention type lists. there was one guy, Carl Craig. He was actually in there, or Carl Cox. I'm sorry, Carl Cox. Carl Craig is out of Detroit. Carl Cox is in the UK. They're both black guys, but Carl Cox he actually plays in Europe, and he was like in the honorable mention section. So he probably.
How much of that, though, do you think has to do with the fact that dance music, for the most part, I used to work at EDC, the Electric Daisy Carnival, the largest music festival in North America, and 175,000 people a day. Other than the brothers that was working with me, there wasn't too many at this massive dance party.
Well, true. And to me, that also comes down to like how things are promoted. I mean, we had problems getting CC Prince and Love Thing played in certain radio stations in the South because they were like, that's not black music. Right. It's not black enough, so there is that issue, but I think some of that comes from how things are promoted to people, how people are, how it is pushed to an audience to say, well, this is what you should like, and this is what you should like, and this is, I kind of see that as something that we don't pay enough attention to, is like how that, I don't know if I can call it politics or anything like that, but how much that plays into
the social engineering, the social engineering of musical taste.
There we go. Social engineering comes into this, and like I said, to me, being in the industry behind the scenes, sort of, and seeing the whole thing, like I said, it put a bad taste in my mouth to some extent about hip hop, because I feel like, okay, yeah, it's a great genre, but you start seeing the social engineering that's going on behind the scenes to make it more popular, and you're realizing this is not just, I mean, even Russell Simmons, let's put that, out there. Russell Simmons was a figurehead. He did not actually do that much at Def Jam, but they needed him to be out there so that they could push this as, this is a black genre, there's a black guy leading this, this is, but most people I know that worked for him, they knew Russell was terrible he had a terrible ear for stuff. It was Rick.
True. It was Rick Rubin behind most of it.
Right.
But what does that say? What does that say then, guys? Pascal and Jeremiah, what does that say then about the subcultural capital of identity and being able to say, okay, because Russell Simmons is black, he is now the authenticator of black music, and it gives him an entree into the elite to a certain degree.
Of course, he's a hip hop bourgeoisie.
Yep. And in a way, that it was like, to me, it was almost like with Nixon pushing the black,
Exactly.
right, the black capitalism.
Russell Simmons pushing the black capitalism, the black debit card, all this other stuff about earn your stuff, blah blah blah. And
right.
We could allegedly make the argument that he's kind of a charlatan.
It was used to push this whole image, like, see, black people are doing it for themselves now, when that wasn't the case.
Yeah, and he's considered a tastemaker, Mr. Buddhist yoga guy, the charities for the peace between communities, and a whole brand. There's a whole brand that comes along with this guy.
So I want to ask you this last question, because we've been talking for 2 hours. We could probably talk for 2 hours more. I definitely would love
Before
to.
Before you ask that question, can I just say something?
Yes.
Thank you. Because you're definitely going to end the show. I just want to say I do love hip hop, and I think what I'm reacting to and learning more about house and liking house more is the capitalism involved in hip hop. So I can still love hip hop, but
can I? Because you said that,
right?
Oh, man, if I can find this line, I was reading this thing as I'm researching for my. I can't find it. If I find it, I'll send it to you, Toussaint. Okay. This woman wrote a very depressing paper on kind of the creation of the teenager. That's also a term that isn't used until the 20th century, right? The teenager, and it's a created market due to post World War II production,
right? You've seen the movie Absolute Beginners. They actually do something on that, which is kind of interesting. Where they kind of mention something about that too. Yeah, but that is the first time to actually spin the market. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting.
Yeah, no. I think this is all important because I think it all leads into this discussion when you talk about kind of the creation of markets and who then gets to say what is what. And as a Black person that does music that isn't traditionally quote Black, there's this new trend I'm seeing with younger people where they have to justify why they like something that may not be stereotypically Black, as Black people created it. Like, you know, these videos, Black people created punk rock music. Black people created all heavy music. It's like, that's not true. And it doesn't have to be that way for you to like it. You can just like it. Like Lenny Kravitz doesn't have to, you know, come out in a dashiki for you to understand that he's a Black dude playing, you know, rock music. It just
They might not like it. They might just want to have that credit.
But I have to say, having people find out that that house music was made by Black people, it's helping. It's helping. Because it's helping to get some attention to it again, you know? I mean, you can see it in the interest. Like, some of the labels are starting to look at us again, you know? Because with Beyonce doing her album, and that actually opened up the door to say, well, no, this is Robin S. and all this stuff before, you know, like, that is opening the door up to say, like, Pump Up the Volume, the documentary I was talking about, I was actually on YouTube, I was reading through the comments. And there was a comment by a woman who definitely seemed like it was a Black girl. She said, wow, I didn't know Black people made house music too, you know? And there is something to that that is helping to get attention to some of the originators. Some of the guys I know who are the originators, who to some extent had been kind of, you know, struggling, are now starting to get some more DJ gigs and more work because there is an interest in the originators, you know, which is a good thing, you know.
Jeremiah, it's so sad and depressing to think that Beyonce had to come out. When I heard that, I refused to believe that. There's no way. House music does not need Beyonce to save it in any way at all. And when you hear that Beyonce helped revive, you know, the success of its founders, which I'm happy for those guys. I'm glad because they deserve it. But I'm like, is that where we've come? We have.
That's the reality, man. That's you know it.
I was introduced to house music by a channel that I don't even know if it exists anymore because I'm here in Mexico. BET used to have a show called Video Vibrations.
Yep.
In Video Vibrations, if I stayed home from school, which I did sometimes in high school, I could watch house music videos of people I never heard. That's where I first heard CeCe Peniston. That's where I first heard Robin S. And this is also back when you could buy cassette singles. There was a Black record store down the street from me in Richmond, California called T's Wazoo Records. And I could go down the street after I heard something and you know, using my lunch money and buy this house music that I was totally in love with. I still love it to this day. You know, sadly, I'm not as old as Pascal, so I couldn't experience like going to clubs and stuff where this stuff was popping. But that was my introduction to the music because it wasn't getting played on the radio until it really blew up. When finally, like, really, really blew, then you know, you heard a little bit more. But Video Vibrations for me, I could hear all that those European house remixes that you couldn't get. She had to go to the special record store to get the UK remix of stuff that probably you were making right there in the States, but was only getting released in Europe.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't even know how people. So this is also in an era where I cannot curate the music that I want to listen to. Now, living in the world of everything that I like is going to get resent to me constantly. How do you break through with something new and different when most people are just getting the same thing regurgitated to them with Spotify and Pandora and apps like that? And then I'll tack on that to this question. What will AI be? Because music that's very repetitive, when plugged into AI, it can spit out so disco house. A lot of this stuff is really repetitive.
Yeah, there's a
what is the factor there? Because we've already established that the industry loves a simplistic way to do things that's cost effective. So yeah, how do you break through in this new era of echo chambers, and is AI going to push certain producers out?
One of the things that's always been true in the music industry that has helped a lot of artists is live performance.
I agree.
You know, and in a way, DJing has become one form of live performance. And basically, the way to break through these days is to get out there and get DJ gigs if you're a producer. To get around, try to spin as many places as you can around the world and everything else, so your name gets out there and everything else. It kind of goes pretty much back to the old formula. You know, now that everything is so easy to get so much music out there and everything, you gotta go back to the old school where you had to have a great live performance and build up a name that way. You know, by people coming to the DJ sets and liking it, coming to your band performance and liking it, touring around, doing shows, you know, so that you build up a reputation and everything else. It's like the old formula still works. That's the way you got to do it. It's networking. It's getting out there and performing, DJing or with your band, and you know that's still the way to do it. Because now it's easier. It's great because now you can distribute your own. So if you build up your name, you don't have to worry about a label, you know, and things like that. But you know, you still got to do the old-fashioned footwork, you know. So yeah.
Of the top streaming artists, to your point, there's a man that has a great music channel. I don't agree with everything he says wholeheartedly, but he makes great music discussions, and I wish he could have been on this show. I'm sure he would have added something. His name is Rick Bedio. Has an interesting YouTube channel, and he went through the top 100 streaming artists on Spotify. And you know, some of them are younger. To us, younger are like, you know, Ed Sheeran, Bieber. But there's still some established groups on that top 100. I think Coldplay was on there, and some, you know, U2, Guns N' Roses and stuff. And so he said, of the top artists, there's one AI artist, and they're way down in the 80s of the top 100. And there's one TikTok artist, and that artist was like, you know, if it wasn't in the hundreds, it was way down the list.
Right.
And he made an interesting point. He goes, to your point, he goes, you still have to get out there and perform and be in the public consciousness. You cannot simply be a home studio musician. Ed Sheeran's been around for what, 8-9 years now, 10 years now. Bruno Mars is one of the top artists. He's been around he's 36. And he's been around for a while, touring, you know, playing festivals. So you still have to put in the work. Skynet hasn't taken over already.
And as far as AI goes too, I mean, that's the thing, is that even with house music, I mean, there's certain DJs that play and you would think it was AI, because it's like they're playing the same boring stuff over, you know. So there's still always a feel for it, you know. It's like you know, AI is only going to regurgitate certain things, you know. I mean, I guess sooner or later they're going to have to teach it some spontaneity, you know, but that is the difference sometimes between what can happen or not. You know, like they're talking about with this writer strike that's going on right now, you know, that's one of the things they're trying to get cut out, is like the ability to use an AI to do a script and then have somebody come in and punch it up or something like that. You know, they're trying to cut that out. The studios from being able to do that. But, you know, the thing is, you realize that even with that, they're going to still need somebody to punch it up, because the scripts that are going to come out are going to be very stilted. It'll be the same plots to some extent. It can only spit out what it takes in. And it's just taking a lot of old scripts and things like that. There's nothing that's going to be that difference that spark that goes off in a whole different direction, you know. And that's the thing we still have as humans. You know?
We can get beyond the capitalist imagination, right? That's what we hope as quote artists. We hope we can move beyond the simplicity of capitalist reproduction. And
it always happens, because it's like with any genre of music, there's a new one. Because one starts coming, it gets popular, it starts to become formulaic, and then there's something else that pops up underneath that says, because people are getting tired of the formula, you know.
Well, Jeremiah McAllister, thank you so much for joining us. It's always an honor and a pleasure. I'm not effing around when I say this. I'm going to play music that you have made as soon as we're off air, and we won't get a copyright strike. Pascal Robert.
Oh yeah, like last time.
Yeah. I didn't even play it. It was a video.
Right, I know.
I didn't even play the sounds.
Right. It's crazy.
Pascal, do you have any parting words before we
I want to say, Jeremiah, thanks for the memories, man. Appreciate you taking us down memory lane with fun memories with house music and its origins, and shout out to Smooth as well for bringing it down to us and talking about something that's very important to the culture.
Yeah.
Also, let's remember, it's 2023. We don't need to be put in any genre boxes. Let's make some dope art, regardless of your influence.
And
MT,
happy Pride.
What'd you say?
Happy Pride. Yeah.
Yes. Happy Pride. Yeah. Do you have any parting words, MT?
Pretty much just that. Happy Pride. The influence is important on our culture. Brings a lot of flair and color. We got to be inclusive like that.
This is what happens when you don't have genre boxes or try to use the power of your subcultural capital to manipulate your way into the bourgeoisie. Thank you very much, Charles Ghost. Thank you for all the super chats. Thank you for everybody watching. This is our first show back, so it's almost like we feel like we're building the channel back up from scratch again. So if you guys enjoyed this show, please share it with your people. And we are
out.